Okay, everyone. Yeah.
Okay. Decoding the Bee Dance by Kush, Abey, and Abhishek. So, our goal for this project is to explore how a bee's brain processes and communicates directional information through the waggle dance. We'll look at how neural systems, like the ring attractor model, help bees remember and share the location of food with other bees in their colony. So, communication is super important in a bee colony. Bees can't survive alone, so they constantly need to share information to work as a team. One of the main ways they do this is through movement, what we call bee dances. These body movements actually send very specific messages to other bees. For example, bees use dances to explain how to build the honeycomb, warn about danger, or where to find food. When a forager bee finds a flower with nectar, it flies back to the hive and does a special dance called the waggle dance. This dance tells two things: the direction to the food and the distance. The direction is shown by the angle of the dance based on the position of the sun, and the distance is shown by how long the bee dances. These dances were decoded by Carl von Frisch, who won the Nobel Prize in 1973 for this discovery. Thanks to him, we now understand how bees use movement to share complex information. So this is just an image of a bee doing the waggle dance. And if you look closely, you can see a bee moving in the waggle pattern, which we talked about. Bees use different dances to share different kinds of information. The waggle dance is more advanced. It tells other bees both the direction and the distance of the nectar source. The angle of the dance tells the direction based on the position of the sun, and the duration tells the distance. But there's also a simpler dance called the round dance. This one is used when nectar is very close to the hive. It doesn't give the direction, it just tells other bees that, hey, there's food nearby. Also, the excitement of a bee, or how fast it shakes, relates to the quantity and quality of the food source.
Okay, now let's talk about neurons. Neurons are the basic building blocks of nervous system responsible for transmitting information throughout the body using electrical signals. In every animal, the brain is mainly made up of neurons, enabling functions such as decision making, sensory interpretation, voluntary movement, and overall motor control. Now let's talk about the central complex. The central complex is a super important part of an insect's brain because it helps the insect make sense of what it's seeing, hearing, and feeling. This is called sensory integration, and to figure out what to do next, which is called action selection, and even track the direction it's facing.
And now we'll get into the ring attractor model. So this model is located within the central complex, which is located within the bee brain. So if you all would envision a circle, if you all would envision the ring, and on the edge of the rim, around the perimeter, envision a certain number of points. You can envision 200, 100 million, it doesn't matter. And each point represents one neuron. So what happens, as you look in a certain direction, the neuron that corresponds to that direction, so say up, would light up with electrical activity because they give out electrical output. This is also known as the bump of activity, which will be referenced throughout this presentation. And if you were to look right, the right neuron would light up with the bump of activity, electrical output. This, we've only done our presentation for 2D navigation, X and Y. We have not yet come to 3D because that is much more complicated, involving much more complex structures. So this information is very important because the bee, it can remember where the bump and activity is located when looking at an important place. First, let's say example, if you look straight ahead, there you have your hive. For the bee, that's an extremely important location. So it saves that bump in activity in its mind, and that bump of the neurological activity. And so now it always knows its direction relative to that bump. And so it can always just fly straight back, which we're getting into here, path integration. So as you can see from our diagram here, the blue line represents the outbound. So the bee takes a certain random path with a random velocity, but it remembers its angle relative to the hive. Once it finds a food source, as you can see over here, it comes pretty much straight back to the nest. Not entirely. I'll explain a little bit why later. It comes pretty much straight back to the nest. but it takes a random course to get there in the first place. So our question is, how does it come straight back to the nest? How does it know exactly where to go without retracing its footsteps? And so the ring attractor model simply acts as an internal compass for it. It tells the bee where, what angle it is looking at relative to the position it has marked, such as the hive. And so what we have here is we have developed code to model this path integration. So the blue line, as you can see, let's start with the X and Y axis. The Y axis represents the angle within the ring attractor model in radians. So 0 radians, pi over 2 radians, negative pi over 2 radians, pi radians, all that stuff. In this case, we're going from 2 point something radians to negative something 0 radians. And the x-axis represents time in seconds. So the blue line represents what direction the bee is actually facing in, and the orange dotted line, represents what direction the neurons of the bee brain actually, what the neurons of the brain actually think the bee is looking at, what direction it's looking at. As you can see, it is fairly accurate. It's not perfect, which explains for the inaccuracy, as you can see within this diagram here. And if it were perfect, it would be a perfectly straight line. But there are slight bumps and edges, as you can see through here. And so this model was developed using 256 neurons via some code and a few equations I'll get to later. If you were to use more neurons, such as 10,000, you would get slightly more accurate, but not that much more accurate. If you were to use 1,000,000 neurons, you would get slightly more accurate, but not by a crazy amount. So there is a peak with how accurate it will be, which is why bees are not perfect in that sense. And so to mathematically represent this within our code, we have defined a variable called function called r of x of t. This represents the firing rate of each of a neuron with respect to the angle x and time t. What this means is you can input a certain angle in radians into this function, and that will correspond to a certain neuron. Then you will also input a certain time, let's say 5 seconds after a relative time. And this function will tell you whether that neuron is electrically active or not. And it'll also tell you about how much it is. It is not a binary system where it's 1 or 0. It tells you by how much it is. And as you can see here, when you graph r of x of t across, let's say, all 256 neurons, you get this curve here. And the peak of this bump represents what direction the bee is looking in. But as you can very clearly see, it is not a straight line kind of bump. It is a curve, which means there are other neurons that are slightly electrically activated that are close to the neurons itself. What this tells us is that the closer, let's say you choose a specific direction, and that corresponds to a specific neuron. The neurons close to that, the other two neurons on the other side of it, will help excite it. It'll make it more electrically active. The neurons on the other side of the ring, on the other side, 180 degrees away, inhibits it, makes it less electrically active, which is why you can see these two plateaus at the bottom. And this graph is also, this is a graphical interpretation of the ring attractor model, which was the ring, if you all remember. And now, what we have done here is we've taken the derivative of this function. So this equation, there's a lot of mathematical terms, and let's start with what it represents. It represents the rate of change of the firing rate of neurons. And for those that have taken calculus, you know that if the derivative is positive, then you can expect the curve to go towards it. So let's say you start at a certain neuron, and then you choose a different neuron, and that derivative of that neuron is positive. You can expect the bump to go toward the direction, and you expect that neuron to become more electrically activated, which means you can expect the bee to look in the direction. So it is a sort of prediction, kind of. Let's start with the variables. You take your negative r value, and then phi is simply a function of x, which is a straight line, and it's not particularly important to the theory. And then what this integral is very interesting. What we have here, as I mentioned before, the neurons close to a specific neuron excite it, but the ones far away inhibit it. This is simply adding up the strength of their connections. And how you measure the strength of their connections is very complicated, and we do not go into that much detail, unfortunately. But you take the integral because you assume there's so many, instead of taking the sum of series, you assume there's so many, there's no point in taking the sum of series. And then for external inputs, this is also very interesting. This takes into account a constant k, as I've shown in the bottom here, and the angular velocity of the bee's head, and then sine of x, which is also that. And then how is this connected to the Waggle dance? Well, to perform the Waggle dance, the bee first has to know exactly where the food source is when they perform it to other bees. So what it does neurologically is it stores that information within its head. So this just simply makes a connection for us humans to understand how a bee is doing the Waggle dance and how it remembers exactly where the hive and where the food is. And so for our future goals, these are some future project ideas we had we thought might be very interesting. As I mentioned before, this is purely for 2D modeling. We do not yet understand, or at least us as a group do not yet understand 3D navigation as it's much more complicated. We can try to make a presentation that would be very cool. Or we can create a vision model that can interpret videos of bees and translate those into simulated ring attractor models. So we can literally see how the bump is traveling across a bee's brain. Or another one, which I find personally very exciting, is discovering different factors that affect eye external. Eye external takes upon many forms across neuroscience. This is just one of the forms used for the ring attractor model. And so you can try and find out how different factors such as bee tiredness or weather conditions might affect the quantity of that value because it is a quantitative value. And that is it. And thank you for listening.